America's cities and towns, in many ways, the nucleus of this country. So when these foundations crack, how can the rest of the country survive? Joining me to discuss these elements, Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at University of Massachusetts. And Richard, I want to talk first about how we got to this point of basic city services cut. And it's not just the extreme cases like Detroit. Most American cities are facing this.
Yes, it's faced by all the cities, it's faced by all the states. And basically it has to do with the crisis that we've had in the United States for the last 3 years. If you have millions of people unemployed, if millions are losing their homes, if jobs are insecure, people don't have incomes, so they don't pay income taxes, people can't afford to make expenditures, so that cities and states don't get sales taxes. The result is the money that cities and states need to rely on, the crisis keeps from them. And as a result, they're trying to figure out what to do, and far too many of them are actually thinking of, instead of helping the crisis, worsening it by cutting the services people need and by laying off public employees, which will actually make the unemployment worse.
A few numbers to throw out that are a little frightening. The National League of Cities says municipal governments will probably come up $56 billion to $83 billion short between now and next year. What does that say? Translate that. I mean, those numbers just seem so enormous.
Those numbers are enormous, and they mean, if they lead, which they don't have to, but if they lead to cutbacks in services and cutbacks in public employees, it'll mean fewer teachers, teachers with less materials to help your children learn, fewer fire machines to help deal with fires, fewer police personnel, fewer health counselors, fewer highway workers. It's going to translate into a diminished quality of life at a crisis time in our society when we need more services and better services from the government, not fewer. It's going to impact everyone.
What about this new plan suggested by a group called the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee? Members, by the way, include Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and Bank of America. So anyhow, this group has suggested to the U.S. Treasury that they should sell extra long bonds, bonds with maturities of up to 100 years, to help lower the government's borrowing costs. Now, break this down for us, because up until now, from what I understand, the longest bonds have been 30 years. Are we hearkening back to the days of World War II where people will be strongly encouraged to buy, like war bonds?
Yes, it's a kind of effort of the government to get itself out of this jam, this economic crisis, by unfortunately doing something that actually helped get them into it, which is borrowing too much money. It is not necessary to borrow too much money because we have one of the wealthiest parts of the society of any country in the world. In the last 30 years, the richest people, the biggest corporations, have done far better than everybody else. They are the ones most able to pay, and they are the ones that the government could call upon. Think of it this way. When the government borrows money, like it's proposing to do with these 100-year bonds, the people and corporations from whom they borrow a lot of it are the richest people, average people don't lend to the government, and the biggest corporations who only have the money to lend to the government because the government didn't tax them in the first place. This is not a reasonable way of going about it. As to your particular question about 100-year bonds, the government is interested because you can borrow these days at very low interest rate, and this way you don't have to pay it back, and you have that low interest rate for 100 years instead of 30. It's a way for the government to borrow even more at a moment when it's advantageous in the short run to do so, but in the long run, the debts of the government become a burden and the justification for cutting services and benefits in the future. Not a wise way to go.
Hard sometimes. I mean, I know you called this the wealthiest country. Hard sometimes to see that, though, when we're so much in debt. I want to talk about this consideration by some states here. They're making this consideration behind the scenes, for the most part, to file for bankruptcy. This would give states the ability to break their obligations with, retirees, which I'm pretty sure is totally illegal, but it would also hurt bondholders. Talk about the extent of the consequences. How terrible of an idea is states filing for bankruptcy?
Well, it does two things that are immediately extremely dangerous. When you file for bankruptcy as a state or a city, you are saying to all the people to whom you have obligations that you can't meet them. There then immediately begins an intense struggle utilizing lots of lawyers as all of the people who have a claim on the bankrupt city or state try to make sure they get their money back. So the pensioners will worry about their pensions, the employees will worry about their pay and their benefits, and the bondholders will worry about getting interest and getting repaid. And so all of them will engage in a struggle that wastes resources, distracts us from solving our social problems, and indeed it adds a whole new layer of conflict to a society at a time it doesn't need it. The other problem about bankruptcy is it makes all the people in America who have a long history, particularly wealthy people, of lending to cities and states think long and hard about doing it because the fear that this will spread to other cities and states that are in trouble becomes a problem. And if cities and states can't borrow the way they used to, they'll either have to do without, and that'll mean cut services, or they'll have to pay higher interest to offset the anxiety and risk that people will associate with cities and states once they start going bankrupt. It hasn't happened very much in this country for a long time, but the crisis is now so severe that cities and states are seriously considering it, and some have begun the legal process.
And the hits just keep on coming. Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts.